Hello and welcome to Dig It. I'm Peter Brown and hosting the show with me today is Chris Day. Hi Chris.
Hi Peter. Wildlife is never out of the news these days, from saving endangered species to the implications of high-profile work such as High Speed 2, mass tree planting targets, to the big peat debate. There's never a dull moment when it comes to protecting our fragile planet. There's never been a more important time to save and protect our wildlife, whether we garden indoor or out. It's our responsibility to help to preserve our precious planet. So today on our Dig It podcast, we're delighted to be joined by Ed Turpin, Community Wildlife Officer from the Wildlife Trust. Hi Ed, how do we find you today?
Hi Chris, yeah, I'm very well, thank you. Glad to be here.
Excellent. And whereabouts are you? Can you put a bit of geography on our map?
Yeah, so I'm quite central in Buckinghamshire. I'm just in the edge of Aylesbury at the moment, so working from home.
So Ed, how did you get into wildlife conservation?
So I trained as a primary school teacher, and I saw a really, really big disconnect between people and nature. It wasn't just the kids, but there was the adults as well. So it was parents and other teachers and some of my colleagues that I was training with at the time. And that it really frustrated me. I'd grown up kind of spending quite a lot of time outdoors, and I wanted to kind of do something about it. So I was lucky enough to start a traineeship with my local wildlife trust, and that put me in a really, really fantastic position to get a job when one came up.
That's great, yes. So I suppose then we perhaps should explain for our listeners a little bit about the Berkshire, Buckinghamshire and Oxford Wildlife Trust. You know, how did it start, what it does, and what's your role within it?
Yeah, so the Berkshire, Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire Wildlife Trust, so we're part of a national federation of 46 county wildlife trusts, but we're really very much your local independent charity. We were founded in 1959 and we're based in Oxford, in Littlemore in Oxford, but we manage 87-ish of our own reserves kind of around our three counties. We have about 150 members of staff and 1,500 volunteers who help support those nature reserves. And our work is basically we encourage others to help protect local wildlife and inspire and support local people and communities to get out there and take some action for nature. We receive absolutely no core government funding, so our work is made entirely possible by the generosity of our members and other supporters, really. So my role within that, I am one of our kind of community wildlife officers. So we have one of my colleagues who covers the west of our region, so that's Oxfordshire and West Berkshire. And then I cover the east of the region, which is Buckinghamshire and East Berkshire. So our role is to get out there, engage with local people and support them to make a difference for wildlife, whether that's meeting a community group or kind of supporting local councils. We just kind of want people to be more connected with nature, really.
Indeed, yes, and certainly your fundraisers obviously regularly come to the Garden Centre, and they obviously chat and wax lyrical about obviously the great areas around the Garden Centre here over in Buckingham. I think there's a couple of places to visit, the two visitor centres, one near Tring and the other in Bedfordshire. I think it's the College Lake site, and I believe there's a live webcam which has a feed which you can see what's going on at the lake, which is fantastic. I think there's 4 educational centres there, and there's also 80 reserves in the Buckingham, Beds and Oxon area. And of course it's all free to go and explore, and I suppose nature, there's so many rare varieties of plants to look after there, and obviously many of your sites will be of SSI interest.
Yeah, absolutely. So we look after a really, really staggering array of kind of wild rare species. There's so many I don't think I could put a number on it. But it's everything from tiny orchids through to these majestic ancient woodlands and everything in between, really. So just over 40 of our sites are at triple SI status at the moment. Up in Buckingham, there's a couple of local sites that your listeners might want to visit. So you've got Foxcote Reservoir, which is really, really fantastic for aquatic plants. And then in the winter, you'll get the waterfowl visiting, so you might get some teal and some shoveler ducks. And then, of course, reed bunting as well. And then another reserve is Pilch Field. So there's some fantastic meadows over there with some really, really brilliant wildflowers and some different species of grass as well, which is it's a fantastic site for damp soil plants, so meadowsweet, marsh valerian, and if you're lucky, there might be some marsh orchids over there as well.
Right, so great for us gardeners and non-gardeners to go and explore. So, Ed, is there one thing you'd wish you'd known when you began your career? I'm thinking of your career as a wildlife officer.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the one thing I wish I'd known was that it's okay to not know everything. I felt that because I didn't necessarily have an ecology-related background or qualification, I was kind of a step behind some of my colleagues, which wasn't the case at all. And learning is such a key part of the process. I'm still learning, and all of my colleagues today, even the most knowledgeable colleagues out there, are still learning. And it's really, really exciting for us. It's very much part of our learning journeys and our conservation journeys as well. So, yeah, it's okay to not know everything, and learning is quite an exciting challenge for us, really.
Yeah, I think that's in all walks of life. That's sometimes useful. Little knowledge sometimes is dangerous, but actually to absorb and take in all the new information, you can accelerate that in a very dynamic way, and that's sometimes the best way of learning, isn't it? Literally on your feet. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, gardens, large or small, patio, yards, people with the minuscule of gardens. A garden can and does create a mosaic to the larger network of natural havens, which obviously links our urban spaces. I think they call them, it's green corridors, isn't it? And certainly nature reserves and the countryside are an important part and integral to the biodiversity in our wildlife. So as your role as a community wildlife officer, can you tell us a little bit about the importance of nature reserves?
Yeah, so nature reserves are really, really important in supporting local wildlife, really. They're all unique and they all provide a real range of habitat for an enormous diverse range of species, from mammals through to insects and everything in between, really. They provide a really, really great place to connect with nature as well. So it's great for people to get out there and connect with nature and wildlife. And it's so important for us to do that. Just 15 minutes outside can have such a big impact and such a huge benefit to our mental health and our well-being. But our nature reserves aren't enough anymore, really. It's estimated that gardens make up about 4 times as much land as all of the national nature reserves across the country. So they are important, but our gardens are just as important at the moment as well.
Indeed, and I suppose with garden sizes declining with new build areas, that is a worry, I suppose, in the long term. But I suppose hedgehogs, bats, your sparrows, song thrushes, and even stagbill beetles now are in decline in the UK. But if we manage our gardens, obviously all wildlife will benefit, and these creatures and many more will find refuge, which will be good. It's not hard to help, and considering the wide host of wild ideas and features. Really, you can just sit back and enjoy and see what visits. So one thing, Ed, if you could change in our day-to-day life, which could have an implication on our wildlife for the better, what one thing would it be?
It's a really, really tough question. It's really hard to pick just one thing. There's so many small changes that we can all make that will make such a big difference. I think for me, I'd say try and move away from chemicals. They can be really, really bad for such a huge range of wildlife. Everything from bumblebees through to hedgehogs. So if we can move away from chemicals, then I think that's a fantastic thing to do. And there's some great alternative ways of doing things as well. You could try some companion planting, so using one species of plant to attract some of the pests, or you could try, broken and baked eggshells, scatter around plants to keep slugs and snails off, and that just saves having to reach for those really, really harmful chemicals and pesticides.
Yeah, pesticides, which are really declining in big numbers now. To say retrospectively, go back 10, 15 years, the number of chemicals on the shelves was obviously burgeoning. Now it's obviously very, very few, which is great news for our wildlife. Actually, thinking about what's happening at the moment, obviously we're still in a major global pandemic. How do you think COVID-19 has impacted on our wildlife?
It's really interesting, and I think we're still kind of coming to understand the full effects of the pandemic, really. During the lockdowns, more people were outside and they were using their local spaces, which is really great, and it's fantastic to see people out there. And I think more people would have definitely found a connection to nature and wildlife during that time, just realised just how important it is. At the same time, I think there's definitely been an increase in some of the damage that we've seen on some of our reserves during the lockdowns. Unfortunately, with the increase of people coming out, there's been that increase in damage and antisocial behaviour, which is quite disappointing and quite upsetting to see, really. But then on the flip side, more people are working from home, so that has reduced the amount of traffic which we've seen on the road. So hopefully that's done wildlife lots of good as well. So it's quite difficult to tell just how deep that impact is, really.
Yeah, I suppose it's going to be the next few years when we start to see any benefits of all the lockdown situations and the fact that nature's had time to breathe, I suppose, over the last sort of 18 months or so. On the effects of the way we garden, obviously garden fences have been long popular, but of course living boundaries can bring rich range of flowers, scent, berries, obviously autumnal colour, and of course wildlife. And at the Garden Centre here, we've obviously championed the use of mixed native hedges for decades to encourage that wide range of wildlife which we long for. So whilst years ago it might have been appealing perhaps for the larger gardens and perhaps the estates and obviously the farms, even small urban gardens now can benefit from the enriched biodiversity a mixed hedge can bring. So what would be your recommendations, Ed, for the perfect wildlife friendly hedge?
I think one of my favourite species is hazel. I just like the way it grows. I think it's got those fantastic straight stems and branches, and those leaves are, if you've ever felt them, they're really kind of soft and furry. They're quite lovely, really. But there's loads of other great options. Field maple is fantastic. So is dog rose. Species like hawthorn is spiky. So that creates a really fantastic kind of natural security barrier around your property. Other species like holly and wild privet will provide that kind of winter evergreen colour. And even the humble bramble is absolutely fantastic for wildlife. It provides a bit of shelter, provides some food for the birds in the form of berries, and there's some flowers on there that will be great for pollinators as well. But it does require some pretty vigorous management, so that's something to be aware of for sure.
Yeah, indeed. And I suppose at this time of the year, we're sort of going well into summer now, into autumn is knocking on the door, that we can start thinking about trimming our mixed native hedges back after, obviously, hopefully, the birds and the fledglings have flown. It's obviously a good, safe time to do that. Thinking about encouraging wildlife into our gardens, obviously, if you introduce a water feature, not just the fish for the newts and the dragonflies and the pond skaters, you'll also provide water for food for the birds, and obviously you'll have a wide range of other plants as well. Any tips, Ed, on what tips you would bring to create that perfect wildlife pond?
Yeah, ponds are such a fantastic thing to do for wildlife. They support such an enormous range of species. So they're really great to have in your garden if you're trying to look out for wildlife. There are some important things that you can think about when you are looking at creating a wildlife pond. So the best wildlife ponds have kind of really good supporting features. So for example, a ramp is really essential for any hedgehogs that fall in. Hedgehogs are really great swimmers, but will drown of exhaustion if they can't get out of the pond. So a ramp out is such a simple thing to do, but actually makes such a big difference for wildlife. Having a kind of shallow area as well is really important. It creates a nice patch for birds to have a bit of a bath and have a drink as well. And it also creates an area where insects can perch and have a drink as well. It might also create a bit of mud, and those muddy patches are okay. They're really great for newts and other amphibians. But if you are creating a pond, and once you've got that set up and ready to go, it's really important to be quite patient and just avoid transferring wildlife between ponds, because that can spread diseases. So just leave your pond, and wildlife will find its own way there quite quickly. Wild ponds are seasonal. Out in the countryside, they will dry up in the summer and then refill again in the winter. But that means kind of most wildlife is quite well adapted to that. So if you are concerned about the water level in your pond, the best thing you can do is to use rainwater from a water spout to top that up. Tap water is far too chemical heavy, so some recycled rainwater is the best thing you can do to top up a pond.
As I say, and you don't need, we use the word pond, but actually any small amount of water within the garden will do the job, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you don't have space for a pond, you could create a mini pond. So anything from, an old washing up bowl or a dustbin cut in half, or even smaller sunken plant pots that you could submerge into the ground. Even the old kitchen sink, that could all be made into a kind of container pond. If you've got children or pets that you're concerned about around a bigger pond, you could do something much smaller. And if you haven't got the space for that, even just a dish of water is fantastic. And if you do put a dish out, it would be great for birds to have a drink from. But by putting some rocks or some marbles or something like that in there, just with a little bit out of the water, it will create a nice perch for things like bumblebees to rest on while they have a bit of a drink. So there are some great other ways of getting some water into your garden as well.
I see pieces highlighted on the Wildlife Trust website, Ed. And what advice would you give to the alternatives being offered?
So peat bogs out in the wild are home to some quite rare species. For example, the sundew, which is one of our native carnivorous plants, which is really, really fantastic to see out in the wild, as well as birds like skylarks. They're quite at home on peat bogs. So if we can help them by making small changes in our gardens, then that's a really, really fantastic thing to do. A lot of the peat-free alternatives that are available now, they used to be probably more expensive than their counterparts, but I think they're becoming kind of more common to see now and more affordable in the process as well. A lot of the alternatives are really great, and I've used quite a few in my garden, and they work just as well as any of the peat-based products, which are really harmful to quite important habitat.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, I must admit, at home I've been using it's a New Horizon product, and that at the moment is top of my favourites. I think it's just the management of these peat-free composts is obviously different. They tend to hold, or tend not to hold, a lot of water because, of course, peat absorbs moisture, as we know. That's one of the biggest problems there. But it's interesting. I know on your website there's some quite interesting information and advice for gardeners when they go out, or for anybody who actually goes out buying, to actually look at the bags as well, because at the moment the information we're getting on compost bags is a bit varied, and I think the whole standard of labelling probably needs to be improved. I think it's been highlighted already. And I think also a lot of our customers now are being a little bit more vocal in the fact that they are looking for peat alternatives. But of course, it's that transition, isn't it? From getting, as you say, you get used to using your own compost, and then suddenly you've got something completely different to work with.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So which is good there. Okay. It's a question we get asked countless times at the garden centre: is how to attract butterflies into the garden, and how to attract perhaps the more attractive ones, if there ever is such a thing. I mean, I thought butterflies are attractive, but never mind. So, any thoughts on encouraging your butterflies?
Yeah, so a good rule of thumb when it comes to butterflies and pollinators in general, really, is that if a plant smells nice to us, it's probably going to be quite attractive for pollinators like butterflies. So if you aim to plant in sunny but relatively sheltered spots, you should be on the right track. Butterflies like that sunshine, but if it's quite breezy, then they'll struggle to stay around for too long. Herbs are fantastic, so lavender, thyme and sage are all great options, and the benefit is some of those can be used in the kitchen as well. But then other plants, primroses, bugle, forget-me-not, hawthorn, bird's-foot trefoil, bramble, and even the humble ivy are all great for butterflies. Another thing to consider is that actually the more caterpillars you have, the more butterflies you're likely to get. So, for example, ladies' smock is fantastic for orange-tip caterpillars. Bird's-foot trefoil is great for common blue caterpillars. Holly and ivy is great for the holly blue. And even the humble stinging nettle is enjoyed by several species. Peacocks, red admirals, small tortoiseshell, and common caterpillars will all use stinging nettles as a larval food source.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, we're all taught, aren't we, to leave a good patch of stinging nettles at the bottom of our gardens for that reason, I suppose. And I think the least we can do as gardeners is to do that. But also, I just wondered if the Wildlife Trust had done any surveys. We mentioned obviously the big butterfly watch, but does the Wildlife Trust have a similar sort of scheme where they track the species, perhaps in their nature reserves?
So we will work with the surveying organisations. So for example, the Big Butterfly Count and Big Butterfly Watch, all those kinds of things. They will all feed in, and we'll be able to access that data. So if you can just get out and count some butterflies, that's a really fantastic thing to do, and it all comes back into conservation and helps several organisations really.
Yeah, exactly. And it's only, I mean, you have to take, I think 15 minutes is all the time you need to take for the big butterfly count, which is good. Now, of course, as well as encouraging butterflies and moths, what's best to perhaps encourage our good old hedgehogs? They've seen a massive decline. I mean, I saw a stat, is it sort of 30% have been lost in the last 10 years? I don't know if that's a bit of newspaper, I don't know, hype, but I mean, it's an incredibly high figure.
Yeah, so that's right. Actually, it is about 30%, and it's quite staggering, really, when you realise actually, a lot of people now haven't even seen a live hedgehog. So there's lots of things we can do. One of the most important things to consider is how the hedgehog is going to get into your garden. So access is really, really important. So just a hole at the bottom of the fence is absolutely ideal, and that means that hedgehogs can get between gardens. So if you cut a hole in your fence, it's really, really important that you talk to your neighbours and encourage them to create similar access so that hedgehogs can get between gardens and access quite a wide area. There is specific hedgehog food available, which works really, really well, but it can be a little bit more expensive. So you can, as a cheaper alternative, you can use cat and dog food. But if you do, just make sure it's higher than 80% meat content. Otherwise, it's not too good for the hedgehogs.
Oh, okay.
And then a few things to avoid. Milk and fish. Hedgehogs are intolerant to both milk and fish. Bread has no real nutritional value to hedgehogs. And avoid putting mealworms out specifically for hedgehogs in really, really high quantities. It has too much phosphate in them, which can then eventually kind of reduce the calcium in hedgehog bones. But if you've got a few that's under a bird feeder that have fallen out of a bird feeder with mealworms, that's absolutely fine. But I would say avoid putting mealworms out specifically for hedgehogs.
Oh, that's really interesting. I didn't realise that the food's there. I noticed we do a product in the shop called it's called Wild Things Hedgehog Food, and that, looking at the ingredients, is dried fruit, berries, nuts, and crunchy nuggets, which does sound very unappealing, perhaps very appealing for our hedgehogs there, which is good. And what about obviously putting water down? I mean, I suspect they'll obviously take a lot of moisture. They'll need a lot of moisture to support the foods they're taking up.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you can put a small dish of water out, then that's a really, really great thing to do. Ponds are fantastic. If there's a shallow area so that a hedgehog can access that water, then that's a great way of providing a source of drinking water. But if you don't have a pond, just a small dish will make such a big wildlife for not just hedgehogs, but all sorts of different things. So you could even put a stone or a marble in there, and then bumblebees can land on that and they can have a drink while they're there as well.
Yeah, and I think certainly our customers here at home are very conscious now of, the limited use of slug pellets in the form of the organic forms, but of course they're going to be pretty toxic to anything really, which is going to be taken in any large quantities. So I suppose if you know you've got a hedgehog in the garden, just don't use any sort of slug baits at all. Avoid those. Use the organic things, the coffee grounds and the broken shells and all the other sort of organic, safe modes of control would be best, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's important that chemicals that might be used on a lawn or something like that will also have an impact on not just hedgehogs but also bumblebees as well, which we really, really need to keep our plants pollinated. So it's believed that actually the chemicals that might be used on a lawn to kill weeds or anything like that will have a huge impact on bumblebee populations and can reduce their reproductive rate as well. So it's important to move away from chemicals as much as possible, really.
Yeah, most definitely. Obviously, birds play an important part in the mixture of wildlife in our gardens. So, obviously, we're conscious of the RSPB Big Bird Watch results. I think the house sparrow came in number one this time around. But again, thoughts on creating the right sort of habitat for our birds, Ed?
So water is again another really, really important thing, and a bird bath is a great way of doing that. Or again, if you've got a pond with a shallow area, that will be fantastic for birds to have a drink and a bath as well. Feeders are great. Studies suggest that birds don't actually rely on garden bird feeders, but they are quite important for them, particularly as it starts to get cold into the winter. It's a great way of making sure that they've got a good source of food as they start heading towards breeding season in spring. So just if you're positioning bird feeders, just try and position them away from any fences or anywhere where a cat could pounce, and near a hedge or a bush so that the birds have got some cover to fly off into if a sparrowhawk comes over looking for some lunch.
Yeah, for sure. Now, certainly at the garden centre here, we're conscious that as we sell lots of hedging plants, that's been one of our specialist areas. Muntjac deer obviously can create all sorts of problems, quite expensive problems for people who are putting in their new hedge line. Obviously, the muntjac's been around for a while. Obviously, it's made its way into the southeast of Britain now. I think it came out of Woburn Park, if memory serves me correctly, and we do see them obviously right across our area of North Buckinghamshire. Do you have any tips on keeping these muntjac deer sort of out of our plots, our gardens? Is there any methods?
So, I mean, if you really, really want to definitely stop a deer like the muntjac, really, the best thing you can do is some sort of deer fencing. For muntjac, they're quite a small species of deer, so about 1.5 meters tall, and that should stop them getting through. But there are other deterrents that you could use. I've heard of some pretty strange ones: mothballs, human hair, and apparently human urine will put them off from coming into an area. I've also heard of people using scented soap strung up But do be aware that if it rains, then you might end up with some interesting soil quality underneath where that's dripping.
Yes, you've painted a really good picture there, Ed. Yes, so, yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, there is a product we sell at the Garden Centre which is available everywhere, and that's, I think, Grazers. They do a product, and again, it's all based on smell, isn't it? It's obviously smells they don't like will detract, hopefully, but of course they have to be reapplied as they're sort of quite a viscous thing. They will need to be re-endorsed. I think you can sort of use that on cloths and hang those in areas around where the muntjac may come in, but it's a difficult one. I suppose with muntjac, it's inevitable you get rabbits. I mean, rabbits can cause all sorts of problems, especially frustrating for us gardeners. What about sort of suitable deterrents? I mean, we're talking about how to keep these wonderful animals out, but I mean, they do they do cause us lots of issues.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are some kind of plant species in particular that rabbits seem to avoid. So peonies, hellebores, foxgloves, daffodils, and apparently snowdrops as well will all be avoided by rabbits. Then more kind of aromatic species, so lavender and rosemary might also work. But the problem is different rabbit populations have slightly different tastes. So what might put one population of rabbits off might actually be attractive to another. So it's quite difficult. You could try a barrier around a vegetable patch, some sort of mesh or netting. But do be aware that if you do that, it might reduce access for something like hedgehogs, which you probably want to encourage because they eat all the slugs. So it's a bit of a catch-22, I'm afraid.
Right, okay. So, yeah, and obviously using deterrents like spiral tree guards, these obviously plastic guards we use, and it's quite good these days. There are biodegradable versions coming out on the market now. A lot more expensive, mind you, but at least they are there if people want to start to protect their young little whips as young plants. We have got a few questions actually who've come in from various sources. One of them refers to spiders. Now, when people talk about spiders, especially ones which bite, maybe we'll have people turning off this podcast, but we want to try and reassure you. I'm sure there's not that many. But this instance, are there any poisonous ones, as this particular person claims that it was bitten and a few days the site became quite itchy? Are there problematic spiders out there we need to be aware of? So
all spiders can bite, that's how they catch their prey, but only a really, really small number have fangs that are actually tough enough to pierce human skin. We have about 650 species of spider in the UK, and it's believed only 12 of those have been recorded to bite humans. So you've only got 12 species to worry about.
Okay.
Out of those 12, there's only a few that will kind of leave any significant effects. So you've got the tube web spider, and then the noble false widow spiders as well. They will leave slightly longer impact, slightly longer effects, and in very, very rare cases, there may be hospitalisation, but that is 1 in a million, really. There are a few other species that bite. The woodlouse spider might do, and can cause some itchiness, so that could be what your friend has been bitten by. But typically on the whole, most spiders aren't aggressive, so you should be fine to pick them up and put them outside.
That's so reassuring to hear. It's so reassuring to hear. Thank you for that. And another question on bird foods that perhaps attract smaller birds, such as the obviously wonderful blue tits, but that pigeons, and I can actually completely sympathise with this, don't like. Can you get sort of specific bird foods for specific species?
So there are certain things that certain species will be drawn to. For example, like Niger seed is fantastic for species like goldfinches. But when it comes to pigeons, unfortunately, they are not too picky. So although they do prefer seeds like corn and wheat and barley, pigeons will pretty much eat anything they can get their beaks on. So what you can do is you could try hanging a feeder in a certain place. If you hang it, it should be probably too delicate for a pigeon to clamber onto. They are not particularly graceful birds. So by hanging the feeders, you'll create better access for smaller birds like blue tits or starlings. Some of the spring-loaded feeders that have squirrel baffles, some of those work quite well. They can be sensitive enough that actually if a pigeon lands on it, it will pull the shutters down and the pigeon can't get to the food. And then other feeders, some of them have kind of like a mesh grill around them, and that creates a gap that smaller birds can get through, but it does keep the pigeons out. And then another kind of final option, if you are really, really keen to keep putting food out for the birds as well, is you could put some food on the ground away from your bird feeders, and that will create kind of a more attractive source of food that the pigeons will go to, and will leave your lovely bird feeders for all of the smaller garden birds.
Yeah, great advice. Yeah, I also found this year actually magpies have been quite a problem on bird feeders, which quite surprised me because I always thought they tended to keep away, but not this year, I'm afraid. Back in May, we had No Mow May, and I think it went down well. It was quite controversial. A lot of the newspapers picked it up as well, but I'm thinking, of course, for you guys at the Wildlife Trust, this was probably a wonderful message to push forward, that wildflowers which grow in our lawns and pasture areas are basically left to grow and flourish through the month of May, so they can actually seed and can actually help our wildlife species. But I suppose the question is, are wildflowers actually beneficial after they've flowered?
Yeah, absolutely. So they look fantastic while they're flowering, but if you want to see them again, then you need to leave them so that the seeds will be distributed. So that might be whether that's kind of blowing in the wind, or by passing bird, or another kind of creature that might walk past and distribute the seeds. If you want them to come back, then you need to leave them so that they can go to seed and then come back up again in the future. But the seeds are also really, really important for wildlife. For example, birds like goldfinches absolutely love teasel heads. And then things like sunflower heads as well, which aren't necessarily wildflowers, but sunflowers are fantastic for insects, and like beetles. They love to hide in them, and they will live kind of all around those flower heads. So just by leaving them, you are helping wildlife as well. Just letting them go to seed.
Yeah, I mean, sunflowers and teasels certainly sort of featured in my garden last year, and they're starting to do their thing now, which is great, and they look so good. They take a bit of space. Well, certainly the teasel certainly gets sort of 6 or 7 foot across and gets to probably 10 foot high, but makes such an imposing plant. And people might say, yeah, it looks a bit like a weed, but then a weed is only a plant growing in the wrong place. I always tell people, so they can look at it that way. So, Ed, what advice would you give to someone wanting to pursue a career similar to yours?
I think there's a few things really. So you don't have to have a relevant degree or qualification. It might be helpful, but it's far from essential. So you can definitely get into conservation without having a relevant qualification. Volunteering is a really great way to get some experience, and traineeships. A lot of wildlife trusts offer traineeships. They're a really, really fantastic way of getting kind of a foot in the door, really, to start that job and get your career moving. And the other thing is to enjoy it, really. Conservation can be quite challenging, but it's such a rewarding job. You know, we get to spend so much time outside and meet some fantastic people, and we get paid to be outdoors, really. What more do you want?
Exactly, that sounds perfect. It sounds like working in a garden centre and working in the garden trade, yeah, which is good. Okay, on that basis then, who are the 3 people who've been most influential to you with your wildlife career, and then obviously your previous teaching career?
It's a really, really good question. So I think I would be, I wouldn't be deserving of a good career in conservation if I didn't say David Attenborough. He's such an inspirational figure, so I'd be wrong to not have him on my list. Another figure for me is definitely Steve Backshaw, who is obviously quite relevant locally. He lives in our 3 counties. But yeah, he was definitely quite inspirational for me as I was growing up, seeing him on the television quite a lot. And then I think it's a bit cheating, I suppose, if I say my parents, but both my parents, my mum and my dad, they were the ones that got me outdoors when I was a kid, really. So their influence, they got me out and kind of inspired me to enjoy nature and to care for it all, really. So I couldn't not have them on my list, I don't think.
No, most definitely. Yeah, our inspirations, from early age are so important, aren't they? I think when I'm thinking about wildlife, Chris Baines, I remember him on the TV many years ago, and he did quite a lot of TV sort of specials. This is probably the days before, really, well, Country File's been going for I don't know how many years, but he used to do a wildlife series, which I found really good, and he sort of inspired me, and he's obviously gone on to do sort of things wildlife related in sort of very commercial setups, which I think is quite important, that you can bring this wildlife element to commerce, which of course is important if there's going to be that sort of good relationship. I think that's quite important. If you could step into your own shoes, what would you have asked yourself that I haven't today?
Oh, I think I would ask what my favourite native species is. That would be my question.
Okay, and could you give us an answer?
It would probably be a red kite. Like I mentioned earlier, I kind of grew up in Kent. I was really lucky if we saw 2 or 3 red kites in a year, and living in this part of the country, we get to see them all the time, and they're such magnificent birds. So that's quite exciting for me. The novelty still definitely hasn't worn off yet.
No, they're amazing birds, and as you're right, I think I saw my first red kite probably 15, maybe 20 years ago over in South Buckinghamshire, going towards around Wickham area. But now, of course, in North Buckinghamshire, they're quite common, if that's the right term for a bird which is so majestic. But they're on the landscape and they're on the wing all the time, aren't they? So yeah, great choice. On your website, on the Wildlife Trust website, there's top 10 things to look out for each month. What would be most likely to see in the month of August, which perhaps our podcast listeners might want to think about? Yeah,
so August is a really, really exciting month. One of the most exciting things I think you can see is probably butterflies. So the painted lady butterflies are all out. They're going to be starting to look really, really wonderful. And if you visit anywhere that's short grassland, you will hopefully, if you're really lucky, you'll see some of the Adonis blue butterflies, which are absolutely spectacular. I don't know if you've ever seen one, but they are like lightning with wings. They are so beautiful. A couple of other things, so you could look out for heather. It's quite often overlooked as just quite a small, unassuming plant, but actually it's some really, really beautiful forms, and the colours on there are absolutely fantastic. And then I think the last thing is gorse. So the flowers have probably gone by August. But if you have a listen as you're walking past, you might hear some popping, which is actually quite interesting. It's the seeds that are popping off and being catapulted away from the parent plant. So August is quite an interesting month. So yeah, lots to look out for.
Indeed. You mentioned butterflies. One thing I haven't really seen an awful lot of yet, are the cabbage whites. Are they late this year, I wonder, because of the cold spring? But I'm not seeing as many sort of dancing around the garden going towards my brassicas just yet. I'm not too sure where they are, but
yeah, a lot of people have said that they haven't seen as many butterflies this year. We think it's down to the weather being a bit cooler. We're into July and it's only really starting to kind of warm up now. So we think it's probably due to it being perhaps a little bit cooler earlier in the year. So hopefully as the weather warms up, we'll start to see lots more wonderful butterflies out there.
Oh, I hope so, yes. Ed, obviously we work on the social media things these days. Where can our listeners perhaps connect with you online? Do you do a blog, or do you do anything within the Wildlife Trust people can follow you?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are on kind of all the usual social medias. So Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We have a profile on all of those. So if you just search for the BBOWT, BBOWT, or the Bucks and Oxfordshire Wildlife Trust, we should come up quite quickly. If not, just have a look on our website. So that's bbowt.org.uk. You can have a look on there, and you can kind of find all our social media links, and there's some great articles and activities you can try in your gardens on there as well.
There certainly is. Yeah, we'll put all the links onto our show notes attached to this podcast. That'll help. And a couple of finally questions. And we do this to all our guests. What piece of the wildlife, animal, species, plant, would you like to be stranded with on your desert island?
This is such a good question. So I've thought about this, and I think I've decided that I would like a birch tree.
Okay.
It would provide some nice shade, a bit of shelter from the sun, some firewood, and birch wood smells really, really lovely if you burn it. There's lots of sap, so I could potentially drink that if I was stranded. There's a bit of wood if I wanted to whittle some stuff from crafts and things. And birch grows really, really quickly, particularly in quite sandy soils. So it would hopefully replenish my supply, so I could, in theory, hopefully with a couple of birch trees, I'd be all right.
Yeah, and if you had two, you could have that would be a good place for your hammock to be strung up, I suppose, on your desert island too. So yeah, perfect.
Perfect. There we go.
Great stuff. Okay, and finally, we usually ask our guests for a joke.
So a brief explanation of an acorn. In a nutshell, it's an oak tree.
Oh dear. Oh my word! There we go. Yeah, well, yeah, we can't really follow that, can we? Great stuff, yeah. Well, from small oaks grow mighty trees, so that's good. Ed, it has been an absolute pleasure chatting to you today, and we're so delighted that BBOWT, as the Garden Centre's chosen charity this year. So it's thanks to you and the great work carried out across all the wildlife trusts across the reserves, and of the projects across the UK, especially to those in the Berkshire, Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire group, who can continue to campaign, obviously fierce campaigns with environmental issues going on at the moment, and bring to the fore local community issues which are obviously close to their heart. Thank you very much, and we hope you've enjoyed the grilling of questions today.
Absolutely, yeah. It's been loads of fun, and thank you for the time and all the support of your visitors as well.
No, thank you very much, Ed. Thank you. You take care.
Thanks very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Well, that was a very interesting interview with Ed there, wasn't it, Chris?
It was indeed.
I loved his idea of using rainwater to top up your wildlife pond. I'd never really thought about that, because obviously tap water's full of chlorine, and
Indeed.
Same as when we used to have fish tanks and fish ponds, it always had to use a dechlorinator, but using rainwater is so much better, I should imagine, for nature.
For sure. And I was going to say that fact of the fact there is over 2 million garden ponds in the UK, that's a conservative estimate. It gives an indication that our fascination for attracting a whole plethora of different types of wildlife is definitely there.
Yeah, because I think the most unusual thing I've ever seen in a garden pond is grass snakes.
Oh, right.
And they are they're terrorists. They eat goldfish, and I'd never realised sort of how sort of good a predator they are until I'd seen them, and they literally cleared a sort of
Really?
goldfish pond, one of my neighbours' goldfish ponds, and yeah, over a very short period of time. And then obviously moved on to the next pond or wherever he slithered off to. But I was amazed, and I didn't realise sort of grass snakes swam or ate fish. But you learn something new every day about nature, don't you?
You do. And I wonder, Peter, would herons, I know they go after koi, but would they go after grass snakes?
I think they do eat snakes. They certainly eat frogs and toads, and probably, because grass snakes aren't that big. I mean, that's the nice thing about them. And obviously, talking about sort of biting spiders, we're really
Indeed.
going into vicious wildlife this show, aren't we? But yeah, no, thankfully, all my encounters with grass snakes, the couple of times I have seen them, have been totally peaceful.
Yeah. I think obviously on the Garden Centre here, a few years ago, I spotted one basking in in our nursery fields.
Okay.
When I was walking the dog, and I must admit, it did take me back a little bit. It slithered off very quickly. Obviously, frightened of us humans, aren't they? They just don't like to be intimidated.
They don't, but they also, I don't know whether it's just me being a coward or what have you, but they certainly frighten me. When you see them, you're like, oh, I don't want to see that.
Yes,
like,
been watching.
Off you run. But
Indeed. But they play an important part, and I think that's the whole essence of Ed's chat, really, was the fact that we really need to harness the wildlife we have and try and preserve it.
Yeah, definitely. It's a really nice tip. I mean, I'm very fortunate in my garden to have hedgehogs that come through, and we've got a fence all round the garden. However, there are a few little sort of, I don't know how, I suppose tennis ball size holes in the gravel board of the fence, and you certainly do see little hedgehogs coming out and about. And one evening I actually managed to get the camera out and take a picture of one, so I'll try and dig that out and maybe put that on the show notes and on the website.
Yeah, why not? I've not had any encounters with hedgehogs in my garden, but certainly the other night it was a wonderful fox. Obviously, I think it must have been quite a large adult, just strutting his or her stuff across the field and looking absolutely spectacular, and no gripes coming quite close to our hedge line, which is a holly hedge. And I was just staring at this amazing animal and doing obviously no harm at all. Don't keep chickens. I used to have chickens many years ago in the garden, but so no perilous antics
Nothing
there.
for him to eat, so you're strolling on by. But I think you're it's very true there that foxes are very beautiful animals, and ultimately we do. I'm living in Northampton. we do get quite a few foxes in the town, and you see them wandering around, and they tend to run off. But yeah, no, I mean, urban foxes these days are a common occurrence in the UK,
indeed.
and I suppose for our Canadian listeners, I don't know if any of you have got brown bears or black bears in your garden, but I know certainly when one of my friends was out in Canada, they always had problems with the bears going in the bins, and
Oh, right.
it's certainly a little bit more troublesome than our urban foxes.
I'd be worried about the bears actually running after me, I think, Peter, somehow or other.
Definitely. Because it's interesting, Chris, isn't it? The fact that obviously as land becomes more valuable and garden sizes shrink, the statistics of what the modern garden is now.
Yes, and the YouGov and for the HTA, Horticultural Trade Association, have done a little bit of research, and they've created a nice little pie chart for us to have a look at. And it is interesting reading that of this pie chart, 31% of gardens are basically a terrace or a patio garden, so quite small, quite
Very
modest.
small.
Yeah. But when you add that to gardens up to the size of a tennis court size, which is probably your sort of average size, should we say?
Some nice, tennis court's a nice size, I'd say.
It's generous, isn't it? Yeah.
But yeah, like you say, 66% of all the gardens in the UK are sort of a tennis court, up to a tennis court in size or smaller.
Yes. It's quite a bit of land, isn't it? A bit of space, and hence that's probably why in the loft of the new builds, which are going up all over the UK, obviously garden sizes are definitely shrinking, and yes, not for the good, unfortunately, for our wildlife especially, and for us to enjoy our outdoor spaces.
Well, especially as so many modern houses, or housing estates, should I say, have just got the sort of overlap panels going around the edges of the garden. And as we were talking earlier, and Ed was saying about the importance of wildlife, and if you have a hedge rather than a overlap panel or a chain link fence or whatever your desired sort of security measure is, not only can the natural hedge provide a very good form of security and possibly a bigger deterrent if you've got dog rows running through your hedge than just some at the top of an overlap panel. The wildlife can obviously pass through it and nest in it and feed from it. So.
Indeed. And I suppose as well, Peter, you could also argue that creating these wildlife corridors, so if you put your hedging plants or even climbing plants over your fences and take them perhaps above the fence height, maybe on some trellis work, and then run that around your garden, that might link to your neighbours' similar sort of setup. That will then keep the flow of nature going there, so you'll have a network of archeries, green archeries of living plants.
That's what they try and do with areas that are being deforested now, aren't they? To rebuild the forests and the nature that goes with that. To literally sort of 10, 20 metre wide strips of forest are replanted to join bigger forests together, and suddenly nature starts reconnecting. It's as if you're sort of reconnecting the arteries of the wildlife. I mean, certainly after the Rose Show, I was inspired to think about planting some climbing roses along my fence line, just because I love the smell of roses, and that one that you told us about, the scent of heaven. Yes, I just thought actually that'd be a really simple thing, because not only will it make it nicer to look at the top of the hedge, or top of the fence rather, it will give me some nice flowers and some nice scents in the summer when the roses are in flower, but also give nature a chance of having another area to propagate black fly and some bugs.
Feeding material for the birds, perhaps.
Yeah, that's it, which then are obviously eaten by the ladybirds, that are then eaten by the sparrows and the larger wildlife.
But certainly on the idea of using shrubs, one plant which I think works really well is Pyrocantho, but trained effectively two-dimensionally, so you grow it very much wall-trained. Okay. And that can look good. Again, plenty of spikes, plenty of thorns to deter the unwary bird. Yes, indeed. So very good for that. But also, again, perfect for attracting all the pollinating insects right at the beginning of the spring when they're in full flower, which obviously they've just finished flowering now, but the berries are going to be forming. And of course, if you choose the right varieties, you can have a real mosaic of yellow, red, and orange berries right through the winter. So yes, that's going to feed the birds. It's going to look good. It's going to give a bit of shelter. You might even get some nesting birds in the depth of the hedge line you produce, and it doesn't have to take lots of the garden.
That's a very good idea, Chris. And the other benefit, I suppose, with Pyrocantho is it has a nice open white flower from memory. It's not the biggest flower, but certainly very pretty and delicate. And I should imagine the bees and the butterflies like it as well.
They do. It's very prolific, and so you're getting lots of interest. Of course, it's evergreen as well, so it ticks all the boxes. And I suppose with smaller gardens, utilising gardens, and I'm a great believer in when you buy a plant from the garden centre or the nursery, look at its dual qualities. Never go for a plant which perhaps just flowers, unless you really love it. Make sure it does something else, either produces berries or has good autumn colour.
Good point.
Or make sure it pays for its keep.
Yeah, definitely. So, Chris, obviously we've learned gardens are a great place for nature, and obviously without lots of nice plants and flowers and things, the wildlife and nature has a very hard time of it. So, have you got any favourite gardens that you like to visit and thinking on a wildlife?
Yes, I mean, all the big gardens, so the likes of, Great Dixter, obviously down in Rye, in Sussex. That's obviously the late, great Christopher Lloyd's stomping ground. He brought in lots of herbaceous plants, lots of roses, lots of perennial drifts, priory planting, all in his wonderful design techniques, including lots of exotic plants. So by just doing that, it became a magnet for wildlife. So I think his garden and the legacy of the way Great Dixter's planted is to be inspired. And if you could replicate any part of that garden, you'd be certainly on the right track for attracting a lot of really good butterflies, bees, and a whole lot of menageries of wonderful wildlife. So certainly that one. And I think also we talk about sort of water gardens. I went there many years ago, but Longstock Water Gardens down in Hampshire, well worth a mention. It looks good, from the spring right through to the autumn. Okay. Big areas of water features, beautifully planted, lots of fantastic marginal plants, great water lilies, so you find all the various creatures living on the pads and hop, skipping and jumping between the flowers as well.
And no doubt lots of dragonflies.
Yes.
It always amazes me in my house in Northampton, which is on a hill, the number of dragonflies you see in the garden. I'd always associated dragonflies with water, but I don't think they actually do need, part of their life cycle, obviously they do need water. Yeah. However, once they've come out of the pond, they are then flying around, and they don't always stay that close to the pond. Yeah. But I suppose also thinking of local gardens to possibly go and visit to look at wildlife. Around Buckingham area, it would be Sanford Garden and Arboretum, which is Lord Hesseltine's place. Now that's open. It's not all the year round, is it?
No, I think he has special dates. I think he opens it through the National Garden Scheme. So yeah, if you have a look on his website, they update that. But well worth a visit. It's huge. Obviously, it's a cross between a very much private garden and an arboretum, but it does include some really good areas where wildlife really does take the major hand, and it works very, very well.
Brilliant.
I will admit, when I visited, I was it was suggested that it is a bit of a Marmite garden. I said, well, yes, beauty is what it is, but some parts obviously work for some people and some most definitely don't for others. So there is some interesting uses of water features, which you perhaps wouldn't expect. He definitely likes to be different in his design, shall we say.
Excellent. So I must try and make the time to go and have a look and wander around that one then. So, Chris, you found a really interesting piece of information for us on the RSPB website, didn't you, about the most popular birds? And I know Freya and I had a fun experience of painting a bird box this spring, and we put it up hoping to get someone move in. However, I think the closest I saw was a sparrow sitting on the top of it.
Right.
But what are the sort of most common birds in the UK at the moment?
Well, the latest RSPB Big Bird Watcher, many of our listeners will have had a go at obviously doing the survey. I remember doing it back early on in the year. And obviously over a period of a number of minutes, you just record what birds you see. Should we go in reverse order? Yeah. So number 10 is the long-tailed tit. Number 9 is the magpie.
Yep.
Number 8, goldfinch. And number 7, the great tit.
Yep.
Number 6, the robin. Number 5, the wood pigeon. Number 4, the blackbird. In the top 3, the starling. Number 2, the blue tit. And number 1, the house sparrow.
So the sparrow is the commonest bird most likely to see in the garden at the moment. That's really interesting because, thinking about sort of the birds you see in your bird feeder, I know sort of when the goldfinches turn up, obviously you tend to get the whole flock of them turn up, and there's always loads of them, and I think it's such a beautiful bird, but they do require the special food, don't they?
They do indeed.
They don't seem to bother with the fat snacks or the common peanuts. They like their
teasels, isn't it?
Yeah, they like the Niger seed, don't they? Which, like you say, comes from teasels. And that's what you see them on in the wild. And I know my grandmother used to grow lots of those, and then had them as she used to dry them in the garage and have them as dried flowers.
Yes,
so they make quite a nice addition to dried flower arrangements.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well, Peter. I mean, this is obviously a snapshot of all the totals, but certainly in my own garden, when I was doing this good old bit of bird spotting, certainly I get a few blue tits in the garden, but mainly it's blackbirds, wood pigeon, and magpies. They tend to be the most dominant larger birds, and then the poor robins, being as they are, they sort of muster in, trying to to guard their territory from time to time. But it is interesting that obviously it does vary from where you are within the towns and the country and everywhere in between. So it is quite an interesting snapshot of what's happening out there.
Yeah, I liked Ed's solution to the question we had from Ilkner about what to feed so that you don't attract pigeons, and I thought that's a very good idea, actually, putting one of those fancy squirrel-proof feeders up, and then at least that way it makes it a bit difficult. Or even just, I know we sell quite a few of the bird feeders with the cages around them, which again will stop the bigger birds getting in.
And of course the squirrel-proof ones as well for those pesky grey squirrels.
Well, but talk about beauty of foxes. We were in the park last night, and there was a couple of squirrels that, I mean, these days squirrels get they're really bold as well now.
They are.
Within about sort of 10 foot of us, there's a couple of squirrels, and they were literally circling around the group of us and looking for food, I suppose. Yeah. But not worried at all by humans these days, are they?
No, not at all. And obviously they are an issue, but we just have to sort of live with them. With so much wildlife, which can be a bit of a problem, it's opportunities for them as well.
Right, yeah, I suppose that's it, isn't it? The pigeons and the squirrels and the foxes are all doing very well at the moment because all the rubbish we leave out for them.
Yes.
So maybe that's the trick. We need to be a bit tidier as human
Most definitely,
beings.
yeah.
So in a couple of Wednesdays' time, we'll be moving on to our September show. And what are we going to be discussing in September, Chris?
Well, we're going to be chatting, obviously looking at the wonderful world of spring flowering bulbs.
Okay, so that time again.
Scarily, yes. Yep.
And so if any of our listeners have got any questions about spring bulbs, please do email them in to us, and we'll try and bring them up on the show.
Indeed, yes, yeah, and that'd be good. And obviously we can talk at a little bit more length then with our bulb expert coming on further on in the month too.
Yeah, because thinking about bulbs, Chris, we've got an interview coming up soon, haven't we?
We have indeed, yes, with a bulb expert.
That'll be mid-September then.
Mid-September, perfect timing for your crocus and obviously all the other wonderful spring flowering bulbs which will be gracing the garden centres and nurseries and everywhere as we see bulbs, not just the traditional places, your supermarkets and your DIY stores. So absolutely, It's a jam-packed time to celebrate the spring, and the best time, of course, to get them planted is through September and into October.
Brilliant. Okay, Chris, well, thank you very much for the show today.
Thank you.
We hope you can all join us again soon.
Today's show was brought to you by Buckingham Garden Centre and Nurseries. The show was hosted by Chris Day and Peter Brown. The show was produced by Peter Brown. And our thanks to Chiltern Music Therapy for providing the music. Thanks for listening.
At Chiltern Music Therapy, we want everyone to know the difference that music can make in their lives. from parents and their premature babies in hospital to grandparents with dementia. We provide music therapy and community music services to people of all ages and needs across England. We work both digitally and in person in people's homes, care homes, schools, hospitals and hospices. Find out more at chilternmusictherapy.co.uk.